From infield tennis ball. I like that. The question was, if you had to distill down every book you've read so far and turn the most meaningful bits into a proverb, what would it be? First of all, cool question, very creative. And I thought about this for a good while, and I think that proverb would be always be teachable. Hey everybody, thank you so much for watching Leaf by Leaf, and welcome to the fifth installment of my Ask Me Anything or Question and Answers series. Thank you so much for all of the really stimulating and interesting and difficult in a good way at times, and just creative questions that you flooded the new mailbox with. And for everyone out there, there is a new email address that you can send questions to for me at any time. It's askleafbyleaf@gmail.com. And what I'm going to start doing after this video is, as those questions come in, I'm going to select from the questions that come into that inbox and answer them one at a time throughout videos here and there. So again, feel free to send any question at any time to askleafbyleaf@gmail.com. All right, enough preamble. Let's jump into the questions from lots of different people. I got the question, where do you get your literary t-shirts? And I get these from a guy named Matt of the Obliterature, and I will put the links in the description of this video. He sells them on T Republic and I think a couple other places, maybe Redbubble. The storefront is called Obliterature, and this shirt is one such shirt. Matt, keep creating these awesome rags. From Oren, starting to see a pattern here with people's names and email addresses. What is your reading speed? And so in general, my reading speed clocks in at around 20 pages an hour for most fiction and nonfiction. Though with some fiction like Gaddis or Pynchon or David Foster Wallace, it's more around 10 pages an hour. And the same with dense philosophy or theology or deeper scientific nonfiction books. Those are more around the 10 pages per hour mark. I advocate slower, more attentive reading, especially for creative fiction where there's so much being offered to the reader. Like Nabokov says in his famous lecture on good readers and good writers, fondle details. From Ed Nichols, what other books you've read that deal with terrorism, whether explicitly or otherwise, would you recommend? When I first read that, I had to really think about it. I thought, have I really read any books that deal directly with terrorism? Then slowly, books like Falling Man by Don DeLillo, Extremely Loud and Incredibly Close by Jonathan Safran Foer came to mind, because Americans who grew up when I did, right through 9/11, these are pretty salient when you think about terrorism. But depending on the way we define terrorism and books about terrorism, there are, of course, books like William Schreier's The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, The Instructions by Adam Levin, Eichmann in Jerusalem and the Origins of Totalitarianism by Hannah Arendt, the incredible work of journalism just simply called Columbine by David Cullen. I know the last name is Cullen. And of course, Rising Up and Rising Down by William T. Vollmann. ZW says, will you be reviewing another tome soon? Against the Day? Another Vollmann? Or other obscure ones? Yes. My most recent tome, of course, was The Tale of Genji, which was the one that I came back into this after the sabbatical with, and I highly, highly recommend it. In fact, speaking of William T. Vollmann, one thing I forgot to mention in the video is that Tale of Genji is one of his favorite books. It's funny you specifically cite Against the Day, and all I'll say about that is just stay tuned. And my next Vollmann is probably going to be The Dying Grass, to continue with his Seven Dreams septology or heptology. I am thinking of making a fairly longish video just going through Infinite Jest. I've got a video out here about Infinite Jest. It's more of like a first level or a primer video. But now that I've spent so much time with it this year because of the conference back in June and everything like that, I kind of want to just go through it from cover to cover without recourse to any secondary material and just sort of talk about why it is I love reading it so much. And so that video will be coming probably next year. Brian Clary also asks, what are the next really big books on your list to read and or tell us about? So in addition to the couple that I've mentioned, there's also some McElroy on the way. But, you know, I like to cycle through and keep variety, obscure, prominent, big, small. Maximus Lerner says, like most readers who slowly push through a mega novel like Moby Dick or The Dawn, by which I presume you mean Don Quixote, do you find yourself thirsting for a smaller novel with sparser prose, such as Le Spectre or Carver? How do you find so much time to read? Specifically, how do you fit it into your schedule alongside a full-time job and spending time with your wife slash friends slash family? What are reappearing themes that truly absorb you in a novel? For me, romance, the threat of violence, and self-destruction will always draw me deeper into a book or film. And finally, are there any young adult fiction reads that you have considered picking up, ranging from S.E. Hinton to some of the Rick Riordan novels? Sorry, I'm not familiar with that name. All right, so for number one, I can honestly say that I don't ever really thirst for smaller, sparser prose books. At least not the way that I do for the big, dense ones. But that's not to say I don't thoroughly enjoy the smaller, minimalist books. To be honest, I don't consider Le Spectre a minimalist. She has achieved something, alchemy is a word that's used a lot with her. She has achieved something outside the bounds of what a Sherwood Anderson, a Raymond Carver, an Ernest Hemingway achieved with their sparse prose, their minimalism. And all these names I've thrown out, I have loved and devoured at one point or another. I was a huge, rabid Raymond Carver fan for a while, and for a year or two, I couldn't get enough. And I have read many slim, sparsely written books that ended up being powerhouses. And on the flip side, I've read some big books that just didn't deliver. I've been swept away by Wolfgang Hilbig and Anne Carson. But there's something about getting totally trapped and enmeshed in those big, sprawling, complex, dense novels for an extended amount of time that really draws out the thirst. All right, so the second one, I get this question a lot, and I think there are two keys. This is the one about how do you find so much time to read. By the way, I took time after receiving all these questions to write out my answers, and so I'm using that a lot so that I could really think through them instead of just extemporaneously rambling in this video, but I'll add some stuff as it comes to me as well. But I think there are two keys. Number one, you have to slowly develop such a lifestyle of reading. It requires support from your family and friends, and it demands personal sacrifices of your time. And the second key is that you have to get really good at compartmentalization, or at least I had to. That is, you have to be able to switch between gears, work mode, family mode, reading mode, hanging out mode, pretty swiftly. A golden rule though, family and job always have to come first in that order. It's also true that I don't watch or play any sports whatsoever, though I do regularly exercise. And compared to the average person, I watch very, very little TV. Well, I don't watch any TV, but very few shows and movies. My coworkers have come to accept that I'm the guy who's going to go and read in his car on lunch break. But every now and then, I'll go out to lunch with everybody. I don't want to be entirely antisocial. Start with an hour a day as your mandatory reading time and agree with all of your dependents in life on what that hour, when that hour is going to be, and then slowly expand it from there. It'll be a matter of trial and error as are most lifestyle changes. All right, the third question on recurring themes that I'm drawn to in literature. To be honest, if something is well written, I don't really care what the content is. But to answer your question directly, the fracturing of ontological and epistemological certainty, especially as it comes in with the tail end of high modernism into postmodernism. And what I mean by that is that, I guess, skepticism against what it means to truly be and what it means to truly know. Intertextuality, or the ongoing conversation of literature and between books across the millennia. The tension of the individual within democracy. And then I would say inherited guilt and the need for and the plight for the achievement of grace. And then for your fourth question, I am terribly sorry to disappoint, but I haven't read or really stayed informed in the realm of young adult fiction. Maybe as my daughter slowly starts to move into that phase, maybe I'll get more acquainted with it. But I have enjoyed a few, and you cited S.E. Hinton. I have read The Outsiders a handful of times. It blows me away that this is written by, I think, a 16-year-old girl at the time and became so iconic. There's also The Book Thief, A Wrinkle in Time, and Lewis Lowry's The Giver, if that can be considered young adult fiction. But outside of those, I'm just not informed enough to give you an answer of any value. I'm sorry. Alpha Royale says, have you ever read any works by Joseph McElroy? Do you ever plan to do a video on him? Well, I have done a video on him, or rather his collection of short stories, Night Soul and other stories, so that's out here. I've read some of his criticism as well, but I recognize that this is far too little representation on the channel for someone of McElroy's prowess and status. And I've talked endlessly across different videos about it's this strange thing where the desire to read him and the anticipation of knowing how much pleasure I'll get out of his work at this point almost causes me to stave off because I want to prolong that delayed gratification. Nonetheless, I'm finally going to give that up, and there will be McElroy on the channel next year. I will say specifically that I'm starting to feel the pull toward Heinz Kidnap and Lookout Cartridge specifically. Lelit Bora, a longtime subscriber and correspondent, says, what are the 5 desirable qualities or habits for a modern day, parentheses, distracted reader? Very good question. I'll start with Nabokov's famous list of qualities for a good reader, which are one who has imagination, memory, a dictionary, some artistic sense, and is a rereader. Now I'll give you my 5. 1. Learn to part with your devices. Number 2, seize regular large chunks of solitary time. Number 3, forget about the impulse to finish something. Number 4, learn to appreciate more than just mere information. And 5, I'll echo Nabokov and say, become a rereader. John Nayland has a few questions here. Which books did you read to your child, or do you read to your child? Do you plan to return to the Western classics like Homer, Shakespeare, etc.? How many of Shakespeare's plays have you read? How do you typically develop your reading lists/reading plans? Is there any author whose oeuvre you plan to read entirely? Good questions. So I used to read all kinds of stuff to my daughter. Some favorites are The Giving Tree, Charlotte's Web, The Boy Who Loved Words, Nutmeg, Pippi Longstocking, Library Mouse, Hans Christian Andersen tales. I don't read to my daughter anymore though. She's almost 12 and we have her read silently each day. I try to nudge her in directions I think she should go, but ultimately I believe that she needs to find her own pleasure in books. I give her a lot of autonomy, and currently she gravitates to Dogman, she gravitates to Rita Telgemeyer's books, Guts, Sisters, Kate DiCamillo, people like that, and I think that's just fine. About the Western Core series, I just posted my Paradise Lost video, so there's your answer. Of course, you didn't know that when you sent this question in, but yes, there it is, and next up will be Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. I believe I've read 10 of Shakespeare's plays as I was thinking through your question. All of his long poems, which there's only 2 long narrative poems, which I actually just reread, I think because of your question, on my recent cabin trip. And I've read all of his sonnets. The sonnets I pretty regularly reread. Having made this channel has made me realize that I seem to have a special reverence for Shakespeare, Borges, and Melville. So much so that I face a very real impasse every time I think about bringing them into a video on this channel. There's almost something sacred about these 3 writers, and my love for their work is so deeply and personally entrenched that there's almost a fear of opening up and bringing them onto the channel. It's like I don't want anyone to say anything negative about them or about the work. And there's also this thing where I feel like talking about them on a video will diminish them. I was just talking to some people about this, specifically with Borges. I'm realizing it more and more now that I've seen how many videos I've done and how Melville, Borges, and Shakespeare are conspicuously absent. Maybe not so much with Borges, but with Shakespeare and Melville, I think that I've intuited this maybe cultural frowning upon gloating about such authors. Nonetheless, I know I need to get over it and open up, let you into my very personal, obsessive, tight-gripped love. Developing reading lists and plans is something that I cannot answer conclusively. It is a very fluid, ever-evolving process that I do not understand at all. The best I can say is that each book I read seems to lead to other books. And there's also this sort of sixth sense that draws me to the next book. I will not have thought about this or that book for ages, and then suddenly it's like it just screams to me from the shelf. There are several authors whose oeuvre I've read entirely. Adam Levine, Marilyn Robinson, Borges, Diane Williams, Hemingway, Carver, Henry Miller, Ted Chiang, Fanon Jeffers, Mark Z. Danielewski, David Foster Wallace, William Gaddis, Michel Houellebecq, Sergio de la Pava, Helen DeWitt, Matthias Enar, Linda Bostrom Knuskord, Jonathan Franzen, some authors whose oeuvre I am close to finishing or will finish: William T. Vollmann, Alexander Theroux, Fleur Jaeggy, Philip Roth, Norman Mailer, Cormac McCarthy, Umberto Eco, Pierre Sange, Cartarescu, Joseph McElroy, Samuel Beckett, Virginia Woolf, Kafka, Joyce, Hawthorne. Wait, maybe I have read all of Joyce's. Well, I can't completely say that I've read Finnegan's Wake, so that one's outstanding. Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, Annie Ernaux. I have friends who tend to get stuck on this or that author, and they'll read through everything they wrote before they move on. I'm just not that way. I like to kind of spiral around. And I will say, going back to lists and reading plans, I do make them endlessly, and they seem to always get thrown out the window. Dylan McNeil, with whom I spent an amazing time reading The Tale of Genji. Which literary character would you most like to meet and why? And I thought about this for a long time. It's a great question. I've been asked it before. I'm going to go with the wife of Bath from Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. And if you have to ask why, just go and read her bits from the tales. And I think you'll pretty quickly agree with me that she'd be someone that would be fun to hang out with. Aiden Riggs says, how do you feel about big YouTubers like PewDiePie promoting literature like Moby Dick, Stoner, Crime and Punishment, etc. to his fan base? And I regret to say that I'm just really not up on YouTubers. My daughter has made me aware of Mr. Beast, who actually lives here in North Carolina, which is kind of cool. But in general, I mean, I'm all for people promoting great literature. I don't know if there's something underlying that question or more to it. I know you are a fan of Nolan, meaning Christopher Nolan. Have you seen Oppenheimer yet? If so, what did you think? Yes, I saw it in the IMAX, and for 3 hours I sat there, jaw agape, stunned. I mean, for any fan of Gravity's Rainbow, those partial shots of the V2 rockets, I mean, it is bone-chilling. I thought every bit of it was done perfectly, and like my friend Brian Counter said, it was as close to a novel as I've seen a movie get, I believe. The other part of it was the sound design was unlike anything I've ever experienced. Tom Sipple asks, do you think that one day you could say that the best book I have ever read was in fact written by AI? What a great, great question, and very appropriate to things we're seeing in our time right now. Depending on how long and in which direction I think on this question, the more complicated it becomes. On the one hand, I think the answer is no, because even now I have trouble saying that this or that book is the best book I have ever read. The question itself makes me break out in hives. Do I think that one day I could say of an AI-written book that it's one of the best books I've ever read? Most likely. Even though it would diminish its value in my eyes immediately were I to find out it was written by AI, because in general, I'm more impressed by what a human can achieve than a machine. Humans have to overcome so many more obstacles than machines do. So that result to me is inherently more impressive. M1 Cell or Misel or Missile says, what 5 books would you recommend a high school AP language student to read? This one kind of made me feel woefully unqualified to answer. I feel so out of touch with high school, period. But high school reading lists, the current high school culture, mind, etc., etc. But I'll answer as best I can based on what I remember of high school. And so I'm going to give you actually two lists, and I'll offer to the best of my ability what I think you're after, and then I'll answer just my 5 books that I think will forever enhance your reading of all literature. So the first list, I'm going to give you The Scarlet Letter by Nathaniel Hawthorne, because you need to confront bigotry and shame culture and the need for grace. 2, Hamlet by Shakespeare, because you need to face existentialism and how to make meaning from your life. I also think that this play poses an excellent set of questions that will help us begin to learn who we are and how we will approach this life. 3 is a short story, The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman, for its inroads into the history of female oppression and the schism between science and art. Number 4, Their Eyes Were Watching God, to begin to a more proper pathway into Black culture. And 5, Atlas Shrugged by Ayn Rand, to start developing your thoughts on capitalism, enterprise, intellectual property, socialism, economic and class divide, whether extreme wealth is justified, and so on. And then the 5 books outside of all the inferences I made for that first list. I think these will enhance your reading of anything forever. Number 1, Orientalism by Edward Said. Number 2, 7 Types of Ambiguity by William Empson. Number 3, Anatomy of Criticism by Northrop Frye. Number 4, The Dialogic Imagination by Mikhail Bakhtin. And number 5, Mimesis by Eric Auerbach. Max Knight says, hope all is well. Maybe cheating here, but there's 2 questions. Well, most people so far have asked 4 or 5, so that's fine. My first is, do you think being an author is something you can achieve if you try? So the good old nature versus nurture question. I'd really love to be a writer, but I constantly doubt success. Would you say that it's worth pursuing? And if you try, anyone can make it? Second question is, how do you grow an online presence? I've tried to make book-related content, but barely get any views. Do you have any advice on how to grow a bigger following? So the first one, I definitely think that being an author, if we just take that at face value, being an author is something you can do if you strive after it and work hard after it. Now, we do have to qualify this a bit. Do I think anyone can be a New York Times best-selling author and live solely off of advances in royalties? No. This isn't something just anyone can achieve if they simply try hard enough. Something like this in our present age takes serious connections, rigorously developed talent, astronomical marketing, and serious perseverance. So taking myself as an example, I wanted so badly to be a best-selling author, to sustain myself as only an author for many, many years. I tried everything: novels, novellas, short stories, poems. Then after countless rejection slips, I submitted a book review to a competition on a whim and won honorable mention, and was published and featured on LitHub. Since then, I've published reviews and essays in several publications, including Kenyon Review, which was a big dream of mine, LARB, Rain Taxi, and so on. So, ta-da, I'm a published author of sorts, not in the way that I originally imagined. As for growing an online presence, this is going to be a very unsatisfying answer. I really don't know, because outside of recording these videos, editing them, and posting them onto YouTube with a promo image on Instagram and X, I don't do anything else. At least I don't do anything to deliberately grow an audience. I just don't have that drive within me. I know some things that it would probably take. If I started posting videos on weighing in my thoughts on banned books right now, if I started posting videos of brand new bestsellers the day that they release, if, I could come up with clickbaity type stuff. But it's just not in me. I am a reader. I'm not a YouTuber, and I cherish my freedom to read whatever I want and talk about whatever I want. Mainly just the first. I cherish my privacy and my solitude and my autonomy as a reader. And this channel for me is nothing more than a way of spouting off the things that I love about the things that I read. In a way, I wish I did have that salesman, entrepreneurial marketing drive to grow this thing, to market this thing, because maybe I could get to a point where I could just do this full time. I could live off of this. I could quit my job and just devote myself to reading and doing these videos. That just requires a degree of what I'll call administrative work that I just don't care for in any way. But this is not to diminish or shame at all the people who are going after that. If there are booktubers out there who are going to go after doing it full time and live off of it, there's nothing wrong with that. It's just not me. I will say there are a great many articles and third-party agencies that can help you with growing a channel and give you lots of great tips and insights. I've read through some of them here and there, and the main thing for me is I just can't add anything else to my time right now because I'm so protective of what reading time I do have. I want to keep doing these videos as minimal effort as possible. I can say that based on subscriber feedback, I think that for me, if you're looking at me as someone to give advice on growing a channel, you see me as someone who has some sort of success or some goal that you would like to reach. And I can tell you that most people, based on their feedback, seem to be reacting to my genuine love of reading. And that's only going to take the channel so far. If you want to go beyond that, you have to take the mindset of a content creator. You have to go beyond just sharing your enthusiasm for something and create something specifically that the audience wants, that the masses want. You need to figure out what topics and books are going to get the most views. You need to make short, flashy videos. You need to do campaigns. You need to push people to subscribe, push people to like your videos, push people to comment. I hope this helps in some way. Sepe Sandra says, you've mentioned before how important the Bible is to you personally. I'm curious to know more about what role religion plays in your life. I assume you're religious, and if so, have your beliefs changed at all throughout your life? Has reading literature and philosophy challenged your beliefs? Let's start with that one. This question terrifies me because religion, like politics, is so divisive, and I hate confrontation and divisiveness. I also hate politics. To a certain degree, I guess I hate religion. But I'll go ahead and put it out there. Yes, I'm a Christian, and it is the most important thing in my life, as is the Bible, my most important book. My beliefs have indeed changed throughout my life, and they are constantly in flux, and reading constantly shapes my beliefs. In fact, I've found a strong parallel between, let's say, the spiritual life and reading as spiritual experience. I read the Bible almost every day. I pray every day. I play drums in our church band. I read a lot of theology and religious books and Bible as literature books, but mostly the Bible itself. It's so important to read the books themselves. Secondary literature is great, but ultimately, reading is about you confronting that original text and seeing what you make of it. In previous videos, you've talked about how many hours a day you spend reading and how important complete silence and solitude is to you. Did you ever, before you were a father, fear that parenthood would be difficult to combine practically with being a serious reader? How has becoming a parent affected your reading habits? Man, that's a good question. I had to think back on that a bit, and to be honest, it made me recall my time reading House of Leaves there in the hospital room, waiting for labor to start, and reading Marilyn Robinson's Gilead on the top of the stairway, sitting on the steps outside of the nursery during my paternity leave while my wife is trying to sleep in the bedroom, and I'm right there ready to jump into action if our daughter starts to whimper in the nursery behind me. I remember reading the plays of Beaumarchais and Molière and Racine while having my infant daughter strapped to the front of me and pacing the downstairs with the book held out like this because she, for a while, would only sleep if she were there and we were up walking back and forth. I remember people saying I'd have a lot less time to read, but I rather found that my reading times simply changed or were fractured throughout the day and night. So I learned to read in sips and swallows, to borrow terms from Stephen King's own writing. Brighton Grace says, are you familiar with the Aussie author Gerald Murnane? He remains relatively obscure, but he has been tipped as a likely nominee for the Nobel Prize for the past few years. As I was reading that question, I was also in the middle of reading Murnane, specifically his history of books, which will come up in the Why Do We Read Fiction series. He had already been on my radar thanks to this channel for a couple of years. David McLean told me about A Million Windows, and others told me about The Plains. Before him, Patrick White has been on my radar. And so I want to get both of them on the channel. Murnane probably sooner than White, maybe White next year. Oh, and I found out that Murnane has won the Patrick White Award for literature. So, yes. Simona Iliescu says, how do you choose the books you want to read? What is your reading plan for next year? I would like to see more YouTube videos on big books. I get that a lot. Clearly, I'm the big book guy. So I answered earlier, and I apologize that it's so nebulous, but the best I can do is to borrow from a mystical idiom and say that the books just kind of call to me. And no matter how much I make lists and plans, they always get defenestrated. Number 2, I've had several different ideas for 2024. They are ever shifting in my mind. The most fixed idea I have, though, will have to await my 2024 kickoff video, or the very first video in early January. Many are the plans of Leaf by Leaf. As for big books, I've got some stuff in the works that I think will slake that thirst. David Arias says, number 1, I'm currently reading The Right Wing, the third part of the Blinding trilogy by Mircea Cartarescu, translated in Spanish, and I envy you so much. When tackling these kinds of books, I found the thematic richness, the different plot lines and characters a bit overwhelming and hard to remember. Do you have any tips to improve the retention of what you read? I think my video on reading big books could be insightful for you if you haven't checked that out. In general, though, with those big, rich, complex books, you have to accept rereading as mandatory. You are not going to get everything the first time. The first time is just for sort of preloading all of the information you need to actually read the book. That is the second time. So that first reading, I think when people hear you need to go ahead and accept that this is a reread type of book, they think that the first read is like throwaway or dismissible or a waste of time. But in fact, it's extremely important because without a first read, you'll never get to the other reads. There's so much going on. Your first read should still be slow, not just skimming through it. You should still give it an effort. Try to follow all the plot lines. Try to keep the characters straight, but accept that you're not going to get everything. The human mind just does not work that way. And accept that the rewards will come in surplus on the subsequent reads with books like that. It's like walking through an exotic museum that you've never been in before. The work is just overwhelming and bewildering, bizarre even. Your concrete default frames of reference are disturbed and shattered, but it's a state of mesmerism and intrigue. Number 2, which books would you recommend for someone who has been a long-time reader and would like to start writing? I've read a great deal of books on writing, and here are some of my personal favorites. A Swim in a Pond in the Rain by George Saunders is instantly mandatory. Bird by Bird by Anne Lamott. Writing Down the Bones by Natalie Goldberg. Zen in the Art of Writing by Ray Bradbury. The Writing Life by Annie Dillard. How to Write a Sentence and How to Read One by America's Professor Stanley Fish. Aspects of the Novel by E.M. Forster. The Art of Fiction by John Gardner. Steering the Craft by Ursula K. Le Guin. The Forest for the Trees by Betsy Lerner. Draft Number 4 by John McPhee. Consider This by Chuck Palahniuk. On Writing Well by William Zinsser. Artful Sentences by Virginia Tufte. And The Books of Karen Elizabeth Gordon. Christian Andreasen asks, do you plan on covering William Faulkner at some point, or Ken Kesey, John Steinbeck, or Conrad? What do you think of short stories? What are your favorites? What are some current writers, artists, poets, etc. you like? So number 1, oh my, yes, Faulkner foremost. Maybe Faulkner is actually in there with Shakespeare, Borges, and Melville, now that I think about it. I've toyed with either Absalom, or the Snopes trilogy as my first Faulkner video. To be honest, there's no denying the importance of Kesey and Steinbeck and Conrad, and I've read them all, but many years ago. Whatever the reason, I just don't feel as much of a pull towards them at present, but that's always subject to change. These things are always in flux. In many ways, I started this channel way too late in my reading life. I think back, and if I had started this channel earlier, I could have captured so many more authors that I was in the throes of. But, this just means that I get to do lots of rereading. For number 2, I answered the short story question in my previous question and answer videos. So there's a whole answer to short stories in Q&A number 4. Number 3, I'm not sure whether by current you mean artists I'm currently liking or on artists that are contemporaries. So I'll answer both. Artists I'm currently liking: Cornelius, Philip Glass, Lily Boulanger, Milton. Contemporary artists I like, I forgot to answer that. I don't know, I find that very tough. And I'm going to shy away from it because I don't want to upset anyone that I might leave out. William Elwood says, my question is, what websites and magazines do you read/follow for their lit crit? Do you have any specific recommendations? I personally enjoy the LA Review of Books, but I occasionally buy a paper copy of the London Review of Books whenever I see there is an appealing essay or review, such as this week's long piece of the 2-volume Penguin Book of French short fiction. And then Unleash the Ginger also said, what websites and magazines do you follow for their lit crit? Do you have any specific recommendations? So to answer both of you, this is again an ever fluctuating list. I subscribe to this and that periodical. I let subscriptions expire and so on. A lot of my criticism also comes from essay collections in book form, but here are a list of sites and magazines that seem to be in my regular rotation. LitHub, NYRB, New Yorker, London Review of Books, LA Review of Books, Rain Taxi, N+1, Paris Review, The American Scholar, Atlantic Monthly, The New York Times, and the LA Times. Joshua Snyder, number 1, do you have a monthly budget for books? And if so, what is it? No strict monthly budget, though I try to stay around $100. Although I do have to confess that I'm sort of on a book buying ban for the rest of the year because in the month of June I spent quite a bit more than usual. Number 2, roughly what percentage of your personal library have you read? I was looking around my library and perusing the shelves and trying to get a feel for this ratio, and I'd say that I've read roughly 95% of the books. I am definitely a reader and not a collector or hoarder. I have no real compulsion to own first editions, to own rare copies. I have no real need to gather up a ton of books and squirrel them away. Number 3, are you familiar with commonplace books? And if so, do you keep one for your reading? Yes. Oh yes, I have a stack of commonplace books, and I keep 3 of them at all times. One for fiction, one for the Bible, and one for literary criticism or secondary literary studies. Felix Redding. First, do you immerse yourself in a novel or do you keep a cool head and be critical? I wrote down notes when I read a book, but when I look back, most of them are me reacting to the events with a short comment or showing my surprise to the author. Sometimes I have questions, but they don't seem very useful, and the answer may come in the following chapters. Moreover, I want to be a better reader and not let my emotions judge a book. I love recommending books to my friends when they ask, and I only want to introduce works that are objectively interesting and valuable. Do you have any advice on that? I absolutely immerse myself in novels. That's the joy of reading, after all. Though I do find the critical faculty is part of my reading experience, I knew never to become a scholar because I cannot keep a cool head, by which I think you mean just staying objective. I'm very imaginatively and emotionally driven. I like to let books sweep me away, and I can hang on the beauty of a sentence for an extended amount of time before actually even trying to understand what the sentence means. But especially on a first read of a book, I tamp down that critical faculty a bit and just enjoy reading the book in as childlike as possible a fashion. I too will jot things here and there, but for the most part I wait for rereads to start critically engaging with the book. In general, I try not to let my mind rush around and rush ahead of the book and try to tell it what it needs to be and let it explain to me what it is. But it sounds like you do exactly what I do. I will jot little notes and remarks, but nothing that I'll linger on for too long. Nothing too intrusive or interruptive of the read on the first time. As far as suggesting books that are objectively interesting and valuable, that's a tall order with literature, which is, of course, inherently subjective and personal. My advice would be only to recommend books that you've read at least twice and are dying to read again. Your second question is, I always love it when you recommend more books in your book review. I want to ask, how do you research and pick up more books after finishing a good one? How do you decide if a book is important, or are you simply open to more information and viewpoints? Definitely always open. Books always lead to other books, whether fiction or nonfiction. I'll tell you a few ways that this happens to me. First of all, I read a lot of lit crit and book reviews and essay collections, and these will inevitably do a lot of the work for you in suggesting or rejecting books or around books or within a certain category. Nonfiction books will often have bibliographies in the back, and one of my great joys is to read through the bibliographies, sometimes before I even read the book. If I'm reading a given nonfiction book and there's an interesting point that is footnoted, and that footnote cites a text from which that interesting thought sprang, well, I'm likely to go and get my hands on that source book. If I've just read a novel, let's say, and then I watch an interview and the author cites another author or book as particularly influential, well, I'm likely to be getting into those books too. If I read a rather complex book and decide to seek out secondary criticism, I will use my university library credentials to search scholarly databases for books and articles, and then read through the abstracts to see what I'm interested in. You also asked what my advice to my 21-year-old self would be about reading. And my advice would be for all readers of all ages, and that is to have fun and try new things. David James Olson says, knowing you appreciate the bard, that is Shakespeare, have you ever delved into the Shakespeare authorship question before, perhaps by way of a well-researched and intriguing YouTube content by Alexander Waugh, Elizabeth Winkler, Alan Green, so on? The incredible discoveries these and other brilliant unorthodox scholars have made suggest the true and hidden authors used an allonym and ingeniously left clever clues for the highly attuned reader and listener. I'm curious, what's your take on the Shakespeare authorship question? And would you be willing to dip into such iconoclastic waters and discuss them on your channel sometime? I love the way you frame this question. I can't say I've ever delved seriously into the material out there. I think the first time I became aware of the debates was through a little book called The Eyre Affair. Eyre being written like Jane Eyre. It's by Jasper Fjord. And not too long ago, I read Shakespeare in Fact by Irvin Leigh Mattis, which argues in the other direction for the Stratfordian Shakespeare. I also listened to that Elizabeth Winkler interview on the History of Literature podcast. Jack Wilson on that podcast is also a big bardolater, and he keeps a healthy balance of people on the show talking about the works themselves, which to me are most important, of course, and then the authorship question. And recently had Winkler on there, and it was very enjoyable. But I guess for me, the authorship question just doesn't interest me so much. And to be honest, whether it was William Shakespeare or Francis Bacon or Shakespeare's sister that wrote the works, we have this incredible writing. And if we ever do discover that it was, say, Shakespeare's sister that wrote all of them, I'll be equally as floored and enamored. I have no real need for it to be William. I won't feel duped by history. One thing, though, I appreciate from such efforts as these unorthodox iconoclastic scholars is that it's a reminder of how easily we inherit ideas and how difficult it can be to modify them, which is a lot of what Winkler's most recent book was about. Thanks for that question. From Luke, I'm curious about how a physical book affects your reading experience. Is reading a book you own different from reading one borrowed from the library? Is reading hardback different from paperback? Is reading an ebook different from a print book? How about a heavy or a cumbersome book versus a light one? You know, I've never really thought much about this, perhaps because I very rarely read books that aren't mine. I don't really read books from the library. I don't borrow books. I don't read on an e-reader just because I feel like my eyes are constantly glued to screens day in and day out. I do feel that reading an ebook is extremely different from a physical book. Having all the leaves bound together in my hand, being able to touch the paper, turn the paper, feel it tactilely, and not smudging glass is just much more satisfying. Heavy and cumbersome books, though at the end of a long reading session, I will notice some minor discomfort in hands and wrists. And sometimes it can be a little bit cumbersome to handle. All of that sort of disappears once I'm immersed in the book. And I guess another way of thinking, so it doesn't matter that much, the size of the book or whatever. But the other thing is that I hardly ever read out and about. I don't read on the subway or read walking down the street. Well, I don't know if many people do that, but I'm not reading on a subway. I'm not going to a cafe. I'm not going here and there. I'm pretty stationary and comfortable in my reading chair here at home or at a cabin or something like that. So the mobility factor is never really an issue for me. An airplane is maybe the most uncomfortable reading situation that I find myself in. But again, it disappears once I'm immersed in the book. And as far as hardcover versus paperback, there is something about paperbacks that is linked to the nostalgia of my early reading life when I rarely got hardcovers. So there is something whimsical and romantic about that, but I have no need. If it's paperback or hardcover, I don't really care. I do like a hardcover because it's sturdier and lasts longer, and let's just face it, it looks better on my shelves. And in fact, I think I've talked about how a pretty good helping of my hardcovers behind me have my paperback reading copy tucked behind them. Luke Tipping says, you've talked about the phenomenology of spirit being the most difficult book that you've read. What work of fiction was the most difficult for you to get through? And I'd have to say, thinking about it, it's either Gravity's Rainbow or Infinite Jest, for sure. I was just so bewildered, yet so intrigued all the way through both of those. Continue to be, to a degree, even on subsequent reads, though the bewilderment is starting to give way to awe. And number 2 from Luke Tipping, over the course of your reading life, which book has elicited the strongest emotional response in you, be it joy, melancholy, anger, etc.? And I'd say it's definitely the Bible, and I think that that book also has the distinction of eliciting the full spectrum of my emotions. Adolfo Villafuerte says, I remember a comment you wrote a while ago saying that you were trying to read less literature from the United States. What do you like the most and the least about the literature produced in your country? Where do you see it going? And boy, this question gives me the howling fantods. The spirit of this aim is the same as what compels me to travel. I want to escape the familiar and thrust myself into the unfamiliar. It doesn't have to do with the value of American literature versus non-American literature. Although I do have to agree with William H. Gass, who asserted that the novel was taken over and perfected by the Latin Americans and has yet to be usurped. Although Mircea Cartarescu may be single-handedly doing this for Romania. I really don't read a lot of contemporary American fiction, so it's very tough for me to say what I do and don't like about it. For the past couple of years, I've found myself snatching up new release hardcovers of American fiction that's highly touted, American literary fiction. And I find that I almost never get around to reading it. And I don't know. I don't know why that is. It could be because I'm getting less and less comfortable is not the right word. Less and less interested in taking the risk. Less and less okay with being disappointed. I can't think of how I want to formulate that, but it's almost like I'm losing this desire to take chances, maybe, which completely flies in the face of some advice I gave a few times, I think throughout this video, talking about try new things and have fun always. So I should do that. But I don't have this need to stay up on the new releases. I find so much comfort in books that I've read many times. I don't know, but I think I'm just trying to paint a picture of why I'm not qualified to answer such a question. Kyle Paulin, have you considered leading any reading groups where the group can message throughout and then do a Zoom call at the end? Yes, I have considered this and a good deal of other projects and events. And to be honest, I'm absolutely overwhelmed with ideas for this channel. I should do a video just talking about all the projects I want to get to. In the end, it's simply time that limits me. I am, always have been, and likely always will be a solitary reader. It's my default mode. I discover and read books in solitude and have for so long that reading groups are just, it's not native to me. But I can learn, though currently no immediate plans. Same as above, but buddy read. Maybe it's a book of your choice and then do a drawing or a book of viewer's choice with a contribution to the channel. I actually just did my second ever buddy read with The Tale of Genji, and in both cases my own reading habits prevailed and sticking to a schedule was really difficult. I do the subscriber wildcard pick now, which started last year and is really fun, but it's technically not a group or a buddy read. And I thank you for your suggestions. I feel like I recall you mentioning you are a Christian. Will you be doing any biblical content? The Bible, yes. Currently, I am toying with whether to do this on Leaf by Leaf or to create its own dedicated channel. I think the Bible, for me, falls into the same category as Shakespeare, Borges, Melville, and as I've discovered in the course of making this video, Faulkner. In many ways, I'm terrified to open up about it. It's just so deeply personal and ingrained in who I am. But at the very least, yes, I do want to start in with some Bible as literature content. I live in Ohio and supporting Ohio authors and books set in Ohio, and love supporting Ohio authors and books set in Ohio. Do you have any similar interests in North Carolina? And well, NC authors, we have Nicholas Sparks, but he won't reply to my emails. Would you ever consider starting your own literary conference after attending the DFW? If so, what author or type of material would it be about? And man, wow. I've never even considered such a thing, honestly. What a thought. In general, though, if I had the money and the time, I think that would be really, really cool, though. Wow, homing in on something would be very difficult, but wow, that would be a lot of fun. Is there a ratio of read to unread books in your library? And like I said earlier, the best I can come up with is that I've read 95% of what I own currently. Would you ever consider annotating a copy of a favorite book and then doing a giveaway or auction of it? Maybe a charitable donation or channel support. And oh my, wow. Yeah. Well, this makes me feel really uncomfortable the way that I feel when asked for my signature. A really cool idea, but oh wow, I don't know if I could get past the feeling of importance or pride or self-aggrandizement to do such a thing. Do you have a favorite book of yours that it doesn't seem anyone talks about? And yes, I do. That would be Look Homeward, Angel by Thomas Wolfe. And finally, have you read Hunger's Brides by Paul Anderson? It's about 1,300 pages. It actually appears in my 10 books that keep defeating me video. Brian Counter, in the preface to his translation of Ruskin's Sesame and Lilies, Proust, after giving several vivid examples, writes, "All those things which reading should have kept us from feeling anything but annoyance at, it has, on the contrary, engraved us so sweet a memory of, that if we still happen today to leaf through those books of another time, it is for no other reason than that they are the only calendars we have kept of days that have vanished." Whether a classic or something from your own personal canon, could you share some examples from your earlier reading days where this phenomenon has occurred? And then, do you find any necessary connection between the text and the memory beyond the formation of the memory itself and its association with the particular text? Brian, as I figured you would, you've asked me a very complex question that I still don't have a great handle on. Though, in an upcoming video in the Why Do We Read Fiction series with Gerald Murnane, I get in this a little more directly. So I'll direct you to that. But I will say that what comes to me over and over when I've thought about this, and when I've thought about what Proust is saying about how distractions from the world outside of the book can engrave on our memories those lost days that are bound with the books now. One example that comes to mind is when I was on a long flight to Sweden and I was reading Céline, The Journey to the End of the Night, and I was nodding off pretty heavily, not because of the book, but I was very jet lagged. It was a long flight with that monotonous engine sound that was just lulling me to sleep. But I fell asleep one time reading it so hardcore and so immediately and heavily that I was awakened instantly by the book thumping on the floor in the aisle, and several people around me jumped as well. And so that moment just is completely tied to that book. And I would never think back on that trip and on that flight without it. And every time I see the spine of that book, or someone says Céline, or I think about Journey to the End of the Night, that's immediately what is interwoven. Nefuso1 says, here's my question. How is it possible to enjoy Infinite Jest? I'm reading it now, 300 pages in, and I find the characters unlikable, the plot non-existent, and the writing pretentious. It feels like the title is literal. DFW wrote it as a joke to prove the literary community would fawn over anything deemed high literature and got the marketing department to advertise it as such. I definitely hear your frustration and incredulity, and honestly, I understand it, and I get where you're coming from. In fact, you've just given me a major boost to create that video I talked about earlier to address these topics. And I want to do a video specifically on why I enjoy reading Infinite Jest without any of the cult of the author or the cult of the book behind it. Just literally the text, reading this text without any recourse to theory, criticism. But for now, I'll say this. So that is to say, I'm going to do a video specifically addressing how it's possible to enjoy Infinite Jest, or at least why I enjoy reading it. Not enjoy being seen reading it, not enjoy the stature, the status, or whatever around all that. But I'll say this for now, though most of the characters can definitely be unlikable, I would try to see it more as that all the characters are deeply flawed and damaged in different ways. The only likable characters to me are Joel Van Dyne and Don Gately. And coincidentally, I think it's about the 300-page mark where they start to come into the narrative in full. Also, there's most definitely a plot, and a really good one at that, and a very universal one in literature and in our life. But like everything else in the book, it's just that the plot is fragmented across 1,000 pages in a way that the human brain isn't prepared to deal with on first pass. And I'll detail that more fully in the forthcoming video. And I will not disagree that the writing can be construed as pretentious, but God help me, I just love it so much. My feeling of the matter is, as with just about anything else, if you've got the talent, let it rip. As for the title and the Stockholm Syndrome of things deemed high literature, there's no denying some truth to that, of course. And there may well be a great many people who herald the novel and the author simply because they believe it's necessary to do so in order to present themselves in a certain light. But you may also be interested to know that David Foster Wallace himself wanted to title the book Failed Entertainment. Ironically, you see, I think he definitely wanted to prove his writerly chops, as anyone great at something should be applauded for doing. But his main goal was to help wake us up from a deepening solecism that he saw plaguing the American mind. Yet he was fearful that no matter how hard he tried or how much work he put into the book, this couldn't be done. This is, of course, a parallel to the fateful film cartridge of the book, for which the book is a synecdoche and the film is a synecdoche of the book. And this very real fear, as opposed to a sham or gloating, was present there in that original title. Like Michael Silverblatt said, sometimes you have to make things strange and difficult in order to say something familiar about the strange and the difficult. Again, though, I do plan on making a video to address these points about Infinite Jest, and I do thank you so much for your question. H.H. Bammel says, what is your take on Bob Dylan as a Nobel Prize laureate for literature? Do you think novels are deserving their positions as the ultimate / quintessential / hegemonic type of literature, or will lyric poetry make a comeback in popular culture? I don't have any take on Bob Dylan and the Nobel Prize because, well, I don't have any insight into Bob Dylan. I know he's a musician, so if I read between the lines, I bet perhaps the question could be framed as how I feel about someone who has written song lyrics, specifically winning the Nobel Prize. And I think it's legit. Stephen Sondheim comes to mind. As far as the novel being the current top echelon of literary form and whether lyric poetry will make a comeback in popular culture, I think the novel's only threats right now are self-help books and the television series. Will lyric poetry make a comeback in popular culture? I highly doubt it unless we change our educational system to teach people how to appreciate it and, of course, overhaul the marketing industry around publishing. Popular culture inherently is going to flow with what sells. Is the novel deserving of its current place? I think so. It's very versatile, though it too is just as easy to abuse as poetry. Hence, for every bad novel, there's a piece of doggerel. The novel is my favorite form of literature, but having recently read Tale of Genji and Paradise Lost, I do long for a time when poetry was more dominant and respected. I think we're just going to have to be okay with being members of Bradbury's underground memorizers and memorializers of literature, as depicted in Fahrenheit 451. Shan Parwani says, I'm starting to read Noli Me Tangere. It's getting very good. I'm enjoying Cristomo Ibarra a lot. Is the Noli an adventure story? I also will be reading El Filibusterismo. the sequel to it. And also, in case you get The Dream of the Red Chamber, I would love to hear your thoughts on it. Also, will you be considering going through the madness of Les Rougon-Macquarrie novels by Émile Zola? Someone put Rizal on my radar a while back, that novel in particular, but I've yet to read it. Dream of the Red Chamber moved way up my list after finishing Tale of Genji because I really want to start building my knowledge of the Eastern literary canon. I've only read 2 novels by Zola, and I don't currently have any plans to do videos, to be honest. Morphusum said, I know you only read serious literature, but do you have favorite pulp fiction or genre fiction? Alternatively, if you have any guilty pleasure favorites or comfort reads. I'm at a place in my life where, to be honest with you, at the sake of sounding elitist and pretentious, the so-called serious literature honestly is my guilty pleasure. I say that as honestly and humbly as I possibly can on video. I will say that in my teenage years and early 20s, I loved horror novels, especially those of Jack Ketchum and Richard Lehman. Raselis Urasawa says, number 1, are you going to make 10 hours long videos on Against the Day, Mason and Dixon, and review the rest of Pynchon's novels? If so, please do and take your time on them. Well, I can't necessarily commit to 10 hours. I'll definitely be making videos on all of Pynchon's work. So far, I've covered Inherent Vice, Mason and Dixon, and Gravity's Rainbow, and so next up is most likely Against the Day. Number 2, are you going to read some Asian-themed books or perhaps compile a list that are the national books or the best ones from select Asian countries? And coincidentally, I have now posted that video on the Tale of Genji. Of course, you couldn't have known that when you sent that in, but I want to start continuing to explore the Eastern canon. I got the abridged Mahabharata and the Ramayana for my birthday. And I got The Whale from Archipelago. So that hits Japan, China, India, and Korea. But yes, I'm going to start working my way around the Eastern canon. Thank you. Number 3, connected to the second question, are you going to read some Filipino books soon? If you're still considering it, I might suggest the Noli Me Tangere duology by Jose Rizal. I answered this with the other person, but that is definitely going to be my first book of Filipino literature. Number 4, not so much a question, but a series of request book recommendations. City of God by St. Augustine, Middlemarch by George Eliot, the Barchester Tower series by Anthony Trollope, and the one and only Boswell's Life of Johnson by his amanuensis James Boswell. Yes, thanks for all the recommendations. The City of God I've only read in excerpts, but it's of course massively important to Catholic philosophy and theology and Western philosophy. Now that I've been so immersed in Paradise Lost, I have a renewed interest in the life in the City of God. I did also read the Confessions by Augustine. Middlemarch is a favorite that deserves to be on the channel ASAP. I've only read 1 book from Trollope. It was The Warden, I think. And I recall him taking swipes at Charles Dickens. Boswell's Life of Johnson is very high on my list. We now enter what I'm calling the Blitz round of questions. This is a list of questions that was sent to me by Jean Daniel in Paris. What is your first memory of being blown away by the word on the page? What did it feel like? How old were you? What did you end up doing after that? And more importantly, which book did the trick? Well, I actually answered this now in my video on The Mysteries by Bill Watterson and John Cash, but it's definitely Calvin and Hobbes, and I think the exact word was transmogrified. It felt like discovering an exotic world all around me, but that had been hidden. I think I was about 8 or 9. The book in particular might have been Homicidal Psycho Jungle Cat. Putting aside their usefulness from a marketing standpoint, what is your take on cover art? Would you sometimes prefer more bland covers like we have in France with La Collection Blanche de Gallimard? I believe you have À la Recherche du Temps Perdu by Proust in that collection. Or is it all the same to you and it doesn't matter? Cover art affects me a great deal. So much so that I will absolutely not get a book if it has that movie adaptation poster on the cover, because this cheapens the whole production of the written product for me. I love the covers that New Directions and Open Letter books produce. They do such a wonderful job. But I agree that those bland, stately covers of Fitzcarraldo editions in London and Gallimard in Paris are beautiful as well. And a lot of their authors deserve that regal, that refinement. Especially if it's Balzac or Proust or Flaubert or Shakespeare even. That refined, understated appearance sort of works better than graphics. You know, it just occurred to me that I even started a category for best cover art or best production design a couple years ago on the channel. What are your takes on these authors, if any? Speed Round, Stefan Zweig, Joan Didion, Shirley Jackson, Louis Ferdinand Céline, John Kennedy Toole, Toni Morrison, J.D. Salinger, James Baldwin, J.K. Huysmans, Henri Michaud, Richard Powers, Philip K. Dick, Don DeLillo, Georges Perec, Vito Gombrowicz. Zweig, depressing but good, understated but deep. Didion, an absolutely remarkable writer no matter whether it's fiction, essay, memoir, or reportage. A treasure of American letters. Jackson, I've only read The Lottery, and it was effective, but doesn't beckon me to read more of her. Céline, I've only read his most popular book, and it has stayed with me over the years. Toole, his book gets the award for the book I've been on the cusp of reading and then opted for something else the most. Morris, savage, violent writer who never fails to seize me by the jugular and show me what it really is like for other people. Salinger, not a fan of the beloved Holden Caulfield. His short fiction is often rather magnificent. Franny and Zoe and the 9 stories are always with me. Baldwin, so important. Huysmans, yes. Michaud, haven't read him. Powers, he absolutely scratches a familiar itch of mine that blends technology and the humanities. Philip K. Dick, haven't read enough. DeLillo, I really don't understand why I haven't made a video yet. Perec, perhaps the best thing to come out of the Oulipo, especially his lipogrammatic work. It's absolutely stunning, and the translations are stunning too. Gombrowicz, I've only read his diary and was absolutely absorbed. Have you read Mars by Fritz Zorn? No. If you could ask only one question to any deceased author, which would it be and what would the question be? I'd ask William Shakespeare if he wrote the works or not, and then I'd answer the question from earlier about the Shakespeare authority question. Which book were you extremely excited to read and ended up being disappointed by? Pass. In Japanese, the word tsundoku means the art of buying more books than you can read. Do you, like Umberto Eco, have what he called an anti-library? That is, an ever-growing personal library, mostly comprised of books you haven't read. 30,000 in Eco's case. Or do you only buy and keep what you've read and can fit onto your shelves? No, I'm definitely more of a reader than a collector. I buy only what I'm going to read, and I keep only what I think is important or that I'll use as reference, and obviously that I'll reread. And I prune my library seasonally. I actually just pruned it of about 25 books last week. Number 8, have you ever read or reread the complete works of an author in chronological order of writing publishing, aside from those who have published very few books? I don't think I've ever done that, no. Aside from writers, what are your favorite artists, no matter what the medium? Painters, sculptors, musicians, architects, dancers, movie directors, and so on. I'm going to pass on this and move it to another medium, or perhaps I'll email you directly. There's just so many, and I want to get the list right. I feel like I've sporadically answered this over the previous Q&As, but of course it's always changing. 10, have you ever thought about launching your own literary review? The idea has actually crossed my mind, but I just don't have time for it. If someone, young or old, who has never read books outside of the occasional beach read and assigned classics at school, asked you for advice, what would be that advice so that they get hooked and want to keep discovering and reading more books? This recently happened with a colleague of mine who just plain never reads, period. I guess he was curious about why I can be so infected by such a boring activity. So I started by asking him what his favorite movies and shows were, and once I discerned that he liked fast-paced stuff and sci-fi stuff, I recommended Dark Matter by Blake Crouch, and it blew him away. He loved it and caught some of the imaginative splendor of reading. So I decided to see if he could tolerate a more detailed world and recommended Snow Crash by Neil Stephenson. It was a little arduous for him, but he pressed through, and I told him to try Andy Weir. So he opted for Project Hail Mary on his own, despite my recommendation of The Martian, and he loved it. He felt that magic that he caught from reading Dark Matter. Now that I've sort of won his trust with recommendations, I've recommended Goodbye Columbus by Philip Roth as something a little more literary. My friend is Jewish, and he relishes Larry David. So I guess the answer is find out what they like outside of literature, their hobbies, their favorite movies, their favorite things to do, and then find a literary connection, then guide them steadily. You won't always luck out and get a perfect hit on the first try, but if you can get that connection, help them make that connection, be the matchmaker within the first few books, they'll get hooked and want to keep scratching that itch. And I realize now that I'm sounding like a drug dealer. Have you ever read Flatland by Edwin Abbott? Yes, I talk about that book in my science bookshelf tour and in the America and the Cult of the Cactus Boots video. I think it's an absolutely amazing and wonderful way for us to try to understand what the fourth dimension would feel like by lowering ourselves into two-dimensionality and imagining what the third dimension, the one we live in, would feel like for a two-dimensional person. Most of the books you show on screen look fairly new. Do you have a secret stash of old beaten books and or incredibly old and rare books? If so, what are they? I am absolutely neurotic about the condition of my books, as my mom can tell you. I go to extremes to keep them in the best shape possible. I have some older books that are banged up, but nothing remarkable. I don't really have anything that would elicit oohs and ahs. If you could be given a lifetime laissez-voir for any original manuscript, which one would you choose? Probably the Bible. Have you ever read any African author? If so, which one did you like? And I feel quite a bit of shame in saying that it looks like it's limited to Chinua Achebe. What is a book that you think is definitely terrible, or at least not very good, that you still love? Great question, but I'm going to pass. Number 17, and what is a book that you know for a fact is great, or at least very good, that you can't stand? Pass. What is the weirdest book you own, or one that feels the most out of place in your library, or that would surprise your devoted viewers most? Probably The Morning of the Magicians. What is your favorite publisher, if any? I'll definitely pass on that one too. Citing favorites always gets me into trouble. What are the things that rub you the wrong way when reading fiction? Pass. Do you own books in languages you absolutely cannot read a word of? I don't have any books that I absolutely cannot read a word of, no. But the closest would be books in Hebrew and Polish. Who, according to you, deserves the Nobel Prize in Literature and will likely never get it? Well, probably William T. Vollmann and Don DeLillo, unfortunately. Would you ever answer Marcel Proust's questionnaire in one of your videos, his famous questionnaire? Yes. And finally, have you ever met one or several of your favorite authors? In what circumstances and what lessons did you learn from these encounters? Yes, I met Jim Gower, and it was an incredible experience. I've talked about it before, but I'll share it again. Way back in 2017, I was absolutely spellbound listening to Michael Silverblatt interview the novelists of Novel Explosives on Bookworm. I bought the book and I lapped it up. I listened to that episode over and over. It really spoke to something deep in me. Fast forward to 2021, and there I am in the Palisades above Sunset Boulevard, meeting Jim and his wife. It was early in the morning. I was sleep deprived, but living off of this adrenaline and euphoria of actually being there. They had this whole spread of breakfast for me. It was beautiful. And Jim was just as cool and collected and chill as you can imagine. And he was sitting on the hearth of a brick fireplace smoking a cigar. And he explained to me that he was in a habit of needing a cigar like most people need morning coffee to wake up and jumpstart his brain. And he showed me this awesome collage he made with the obituary of Jacques Derrida. He regaled me with stories of times in Portugal and France and all over the world, all these authors, editors, people in the literary industry. As he talked, I could hear the voice of Alvaro from Novel Explosives, and it was fascinating. Fascinating. So that's it for our fifth installment of questions and answers. I really appreciate everyone. These were a wonderful batch of questions. It's amazing that the first 4 videos have not exhausted the creativity and curiosity. And like I said, feel free to email askleafbyleaf@gmail.com anytime, and I'm going to start to interweave my videos with select questions. And with that, I think I'm going to go and read for a while, and I hope you will too.